In 1830, a man by the name of Daniel Hillman started a blast furnace in central Alabama in order to capitalize on the iron making business in the area that had low competition and ample natural resources. Though Hillman would die shortly after establishing his forge, the ironworks would have a successful career up to and during the Civil War before being burned by Union soldiers. The historic furnace is known today as Tannehill Ironworks, and this furnace, along with a few others in central Alabama, laid the foundations for one of the greatest iron and steel making districts in the world, Birmingham, Alabama. Hillman, who was an expert iron maker, traveled to Alabama when he heard of a seam of brown ore in Roop's Valley. This seam turned out to be the largest he had ever seen, and he instantly began setting up a furnace on it. The location was about as good as you can ask for, located on a hillside with water power, roads, and plenty of trees for fuel. The furnace saw instant success.
So the Tannehill Iron Works was a furnace company that started in 1830. It started as a small little forge over here on Roops Creek, and from there it evolved into a very large furnace company that was owned by multiple different owners, uh, all the way up through the Civil War, and eventually during the war supplied iron to Selma Arsenal and basically all of the Confederacy.
In 1840, the Hillman Forge was sold to Colonel Neenan Tannehill, the namesake of the forge and the area surrounding it. Tannehill ran the forge for 17 years until it traded hands once again and expanded. But by this time, Tannehill was not alone in the iron-making business. By 1849, Shelby Iron Works in nearby Shelby County, Alabama, was producing 5 tons of pig iron a day. Along with this, there were forges dotted all across central Alabama, including Briarfield, Irondale, and Oxmoor forges. With more furnaces coming to the future site of Birmingham, Alabama, more investors began to take notice of the area.
One thing that's important to note is that most of these furnace companies weren't centered around any kind of war effort. They weren't making guns and that sort of thing. Most of them were making what we call hollowware. So that's your everyday pots and pans, piping, things that you would need in a household or a village that you would need iron for. They were supplying iron for the local populations.
Tannehill would once again trade hands in the 1850s to Moses Straub, who would expand the operations even further. He built the large furnaces seen at the site today, along with being the owner of the forge at the onset of the Civil War.
So Tannehill's role during the Civil War, it was not a Confederate-owned ironworks. There were some. We had a sister park, Briarfield Ironworks State Park, that was owned by the Confederacy during the Civil War. But because of the size and scale of the Tannehill operation at that time, it was one of the main suppliers for the Confederacy in Alabama, and specifically the Selma Arsenal. So most of the iron that was produced here during the Civil War was shipped down first to Montevallo and then by train to Selma.
When war broke out between the states, the Confederacy began ramping up operations in order to compete with the industrial North. Tannehill Ironworks began running the forge constantly, producing up to 22 tons of steel a day. At the height of the war, the state of Alabama was producing 15,000 tons of steel a year, nearly a 400% increase from 10 years prior. Despite this production, it was still not enough to keep up with the northern industrial scale furnaces. The overuse and abuse of Tannehill furnace began to take its toll.
They were never meant to be run 24/7 like the furnaces that you see in Birmingham. They were never meant to be run constantly and every day. They were meant to produce the amount of iron needed for a specific area. And when you start getting into the Civil War, what you start seeing is trying to run these furnaces every day in order to supply the war effort, the furnaces themselves break down. So the furnaces here at Tannehill were rebuilt multiple times during the Civil War. Same with Briarfield, they would degrade. The materials used to construct them were not up to the standards that we would eventually see in Birmingham. They were poorly constructed furnaces, but only because of the limitations of the time. And so, as you see companies try to transition from the Civil War period into a modern industrial age in the South, the old furnaces that we have here and at places like Briarfield and Shelby, those start to kind of fall to the wayside. They're not able to keep up with the production requirements that you need for a fully industrialized society.
In late March of 1865, Union General Croxton was marching through central Alabama with the mission of wiping out the state's ironworks. While stationed in Elton, near where Birmingham would later be built, Croxton learned that no one was guarding Tannehill Ironworks and set out to destroy it. By the end of the day, Tannehill was lay in near ruins. All three forges were unusable, the buildings were burned, and the steam engines were destroyed. Croxton and his men went on to destroy multiple other ironworks in the nearby area. And by the end of the war, Alabama's ironwork industry was nothing but ashes. But this is not where this story ends. In the years following the Civil War, many of the destroyed furnaces would once again open. Shelby, Briarfield, and Oxmoor all saw a new life post war. But this fate was not shared by Tannehill. Forges in Roop's Valley would never again be lit. On January 26, 1871, the Elton Land Company was formed with the goal of forming the city of Birmingham in nearby Jones Valley. In 1876, William Gesner of the Academy of Natural Sciences of Pennsylvania described Jones Valley as being filled with inexhaustible amounts of natural resources for iron making and was surprised at the lack of development that it had previously seen. Soon after, Birmingham's first industrial scale furnace would open, Alice Furnace, thus bringing about a new era for Alabama industry. It seems poetic, in a sort of tragic way, that the furnaces that started it all brought in the first investors of Alabama iron and was killed by the hands of men stationed in Elton, never saw this new era. It was only through the total destruction of it all that allowed for everything to be rebuilt. Shelby and Briarfield died out soon after Birmingham's beginning. It was the dawn of a new age, the age of the Magic City.
So back in the late 50s, early 60s, um, when historians from the University of Alabama and a lot of interested parties from around the state wanted to create Tannehill Ironworks, they ran into multiple roadblocks, of course, but the biggest one was actually the moonshine operation that was going on here. So Roop's Creek, which once provided power to the furnaces, was being used for stills. Basically, moonshiners from that period were using that waterway to create moonshine and to uh, basically use it as a base of operations to ship moonshine from. And when people started saying, hey, we want to protect this land, we want to turn it into a state park, that would have been, pretty much an end for that business. And so the moonshiners thought, well, if we make it so that they don't have a historical structure to base the park around, then they can't turn it into a historic landmark. So what they did is they strapped dynamite to furnace number one, which was the only standing furnace at the time, um, and blew a big gaping hole in the side of the furnace. Uh, well, luckily, because the other two furnaces were already in ruins, the plan was already to rebuild furnaces. And we already had people that were contracted and planned to redesign and rebuild those furnaces in the way that they had been built back in the 1800s. And so it wasn't enough damage to really dissuade anybody. They ended up patching up the hole and putting in that section of rock again, and you end up with the park that you have today. Um, but yeah, all of that almost could have been shut down due to some whiskey makers.